Star. Got more than a couple of people going mad, I swear they're rooting hard. Tell them I be big in the game like she went and got them breast implants. I said I'm moving too fast, didn't even get a glance. I'm ready to eat up track like I'm seated in a restaurant. If you had swag like mine, you know it's best to flaunt. We are hating because you want, shining like it's neon, rock like it's a Leon. Shooting stars across the galaxy. Shoot, 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 shoot. Yeah, shoot, shoot. Yeah, shoot, shoot, shoot. Yeah, shoot, shoot. Too far. Get to class.
Ciao.
Premiumbeat.com.
Let's go.